Okay, Brother Hayden, praise him. Amen. Okay, so 2 Samuel chapter 5. We studied last week as best we could, I suppose, with the time we were given, about the death of Ishbosheth. About that was the last line of Saul that was kingship. Now Ishbosheth is dead. Like I told you guys, we're going to be coming into David is now officially the king of Israel. He's been king of Judah for quite some time now, but now he is officially going to be made king of Israel. We start in verse 1. Then came all the tribes of Israel to David unto Hebron, and spake, saying, Behold, we are thy bone and thy flesh. Also in time when Saul was king over us, thou wast he that leddest out and broughtest in Israel. And the Lord said unto thee, Thou shalt feed my people Israel, and thou shalt be captain over Israel. So all the elders of Israel came to the king to Hebron, and the king David made a league with them in Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah. We'll stop there. It's pretty easy. Now that Ishbosheth is dead, we talked about last week the importance of the death of Abner to the people of Israel. It spoke volumes to the weakness of Ishbosheth and how he was not fit to be king. When Abner was slain by Joab, the Bible very clearly states his hands trembled, a sign of weakness. He was weak. He was not king material. And as always, unfortunately, you guys, I have to relate this to the young men who I study with. And we spoke in great length about the importance of being strong, being courageous, being bold, for whatever God's called you to be, whether it's the father of your family or just a guy at work. Be bold, be courageous, be strong in what you do, because weakness not only affects you, it affects everyone around you. Weakness is a disease, and it spreads really big. I mean, it's quick, and we can all relate to that, even you young guys. We talked about last week the importance of being strong, that if you're called to lead and you fail, that's one thing. But if you're called to lead and you're scared and you're weak and you don't know how to lead, that not only affects you, that affects everyone around you. That being courageous is probably one of the marks of godly leadership. And we talked about the importance of the things that you'll never see your father probably do if he's a good man of God. You'll never see your father sweat. You might see him scared. You might see him physically disturbed. But we talked about the importance of you don't know the number of nights, and I know you folks that have had families, you folks that, I know you guys, I've done it myself. The nights you've sat up and worried about stuff that weren't in your control. How is this going to get done? The bills, how are we going to keep food on the table? I personally have never been laid off on a job, I mean, other than taking a layoff because there wasn't work. But I think back in 2008, we had a massive layoff at work, and I was spared. Thank God I was spared from it. But I couldn't imagine men that come into work that day thinking they were going to get a paycheck, And then next week, there's going to start the next week. And that Friday, there's going to get a paycheck. And then the next Friday, we're going to get a paycheck. But then all of a sudden, we're handing out pieces of paper saying, you ain't getting paid no more. I mean, I thought about that greatly last week, how that affected their family. Did they go home wringing their hands, scared to death? What are we going to do? What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Or did they just man up, suck it up, keep going? What are we going to do? I'm going to look for a job. That's what I'm going to do. So, I stress to you young men once again, and I stress it to you, and I stress it to you, and I stress it to you. There is nothing wrong with having emotion. We all feel. We all get scared. We all get hurt. We all get sad. We all get angry. That's just part of the human condition. We're rigged that way. God gave us emotion, and they affect us. But we cannot allow our emotions to drive us. And we've talked about that. We haven't come to it yet, but we've talked about there will be a point in time in King David's life when his emotion nearly destroys his kingdom. We talked about some of David's great weaknesses, and one of his greatest weaknesses was his love for people. When he wept over the death of Ishbosheth in this last chapter, he really wept. I mean, he was really, really disturbed over the death of Ishbosheth. He loved Saul. He loved Saul's children. That was something you could say about David. He was a man of great love for his enemy, because ultimately that's what Ishbosheth was. He was the enemy of the king. And now we've come to a place to where David is officially king over Israel. He's not just the king of Judah anymore. All the other tribes have come and they've made a pact with him, and they've recognized him as king, and they've said, David, you're going to be our leader. And I could not imagine at 30 years old the amount of responsibility and weight that David had on his shoulders. That is incredible. That is. When I found out Andrew was coming along, it was a Thursday. And we were going out to, honestly, the day's plan was I was going to get off work, I was going to meet up with my friends, and we were going to go fishing and then go get something to eat afterwards. And I come home, and there's Andrew's mom sitting on the couch. I need to tell you something. Oh, what do you need to tell me? I'm pregnant. Man, I was 20 years old. I was scared to death. Literally. I never let her see me do it, but I went in that bathroom and I cried my eyes out. I cried. I don't want this. I don't need this. Man, that's a lot to deal with. Like, she had talked about 6 months before that about having a baby, and I went and got her a dog. Like, I thought, that'll fix it. Seriously, that's how we wound up with the dog, because that was a really good idea. Like, oh yeah, hold on now, I don't want this, man. I had a good life. I lived on the beach, did what I wanted to, worked a lot, played a lot. It was good. I mean, we had a good time. And now at 20, I'm fixing to have a kid. That was horrible. I mean, praise God, I love my children. He's upstairs. Andrew, I love you. You know, you're the best mistake I ever made. But ultimately, that weight of responsibility on my shoulders. And I tell you, young men, out of every other time that somebody's, the joy, I'm going to have a baby, and then the next time I'm going to have a baby, that feeling never left me. That fear, that what are we going to do? We're stretched already. I've got enough going on. I don't need the more. So I can only imagine the amount of prayer, dedication to the Lord. I mean, I know David had a vision where God told him that, you're going to be the king and you're anointed man and you're going to be the guy for the job. And I know I never had that with these children, but I could only imagine at 30, David having to be the king of a nation. That is incredible. David reigned as king longer than David was just David, that guy. At 30, he was officially the king of Israel. And it says here that he reigned, 37 years? That is crazy. And here we go. And the king and his men went to Jerusalem unto the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, which spake unto David, saying, Except thou take away the blind and the lame, thou shalt not come in hither, thinking David cannot come in hither. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, the same is the city of David. And David said on that day, Whosoever getteth up to the gutter, and smiteth the Jebusites, and the lame and the blind, that are hated of David's soul, he shall be chief and captain. Wherefore they said, The blind and the lame shall not come into the house. So David dwelt in the fort, and came into the city of David, and David built around from Milo and inward. And David went on and grew great, and the Lord God of hosts was with him. For you young guys, and I know I keep talking to them, but I don't have you guys next week. I've got them, so we're going to deal with it. I promised you this is one of the most blood-filled books of the Bible. I mean, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of war. David was known as a man of war, a bloody man, God called him. And so here we see David. He's now king. He was, his capital, his court was at Hebron, but now David's going to take Jerusalem. And this is a major, major thing. If you do not believe me in that, read your Bible. The city of Jerusalem from this point on plays a key role in everything that happens, not only to the Jewish people, but to planet Earth. You find it in the book of Revelation. For whatever reason, who knows, I don't. This is the city that God said, this is mine, and I'm going to live here. And this is where my people are going to live. This is where I'm going to set up my kingdom. This is my spot on planet Earth that I find more important than almost any other spot on planet Earth. This is where I will build my temple. This is where I'll dwell. And in this, we see David doing something that even Joshua, that great leader, that great man of God that we studied, he didn't even do it. He finally took Zion. He finally come up and he conquered the Jebusites. This piece of real estate, and study it out, man. It is so good to study this out. To this day, this is one of the most hotly contested pieces of ground on planet Earth. You cannot watch the news. You cannot read a newspaper without someone contesting the ownership of Israel and who it belongs to. And we see here the Jebusites who dwelled in Jerusalem, they mocked David. They said, let David come. Unless he kills every single person here, the blind and the lame, he says, he can't take the city. Basically what he was saying was, the worst that we have in this city can take David's men. But they didn't know David. We always go back to that great moment in David's life that so many movies and books have been read about, when David slayed Goliath. And we're real quick to say, oh, that little boy David with no armor, he ran out there with courage and strength, and he looked that giant in the eye that no man would face. Oh, and he just killed him. Oh, he was so godly. But if you really look at what David had to say about killing Goliath, if you guys remember, we talked about this greatly over a course of a couple of weeks. But David said, this ain't nothing. I mean, who's this guy? What are you afraid of? David tells the Israelites when they're in camp, he says, I killed a lion and a bear with a stick. You killed a bear with a stick? Anybody here? I've never killed a bear in my life. I could imagine. And when he uses the term lion, these were the real thing. These weren't big cats. At that time, and there's historical documents to prove it, there were lions in that area. I'm talking, Lion King kind of. In fact, we watched that last night. It's a good movie. Everybody should watch it. Lion King's a good movie, but till you go to the zoo and you see one, I guess is what I'm getting at. It's a big animal. That's a lot. So here we see David. He wasn't scared. There was no fear in him. He was the right man for the job. God called the right man because at a tender young age as a shepherd boy, David was known to kill animals. He was known to kill lions, to kill bears with his bare hands. So what is a guy with a sling and a bow to him? Nothing. So one of the things that we'll see more than this instance right here is that David is not the kind of guy that you tease. You don't poke fun at him. You don't make fun of him. Because David is a violent person. David is a bloody man. David is a military genius. And David is the kind of guy that he don't just order the troops from the back. He gets in the mix with it. We talked about how David got his first wife, the daughter of Saul. We won't go into grave detail on it, but you guys know what I'm talking about. How he secured his dowry to her. What he had to do. That's a very violent person. To do that, that's just about sociopath. So here we have David. He's taken the city. And he's told those guys, hey, whoever helps me take this city will be the chief and captain of my army. And we'll really get into that later on. You'll learn a lot about David's mighty men. That is something to really study out, those guys that were just so powerful in David's life. But we continue. I want to get through this week. I don't want to get hung up on it because I really want to hit the ark next week big. And David went on and grew great, and the Lord God of hosts was with him. And Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, and cedar trees and carpenters and masons, and they built David an house. And David perceived that the Lord had established him king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for his people Israel's sake. That is so important. That is really the mark of David. That is the mark of true godly leadership, and that's something that you young men need to take a hold of at a young age. The one thing that could be said about David at this point in time in his life was he was not ate up with pride. At the age of 30, he was the king of one of the greatest nations on planet Earth. You can't even be president at 30. And we see here in the early parts of his reign the recognition by other leaders in the world of the kingship of David. When it says the king of Tyre sent him carpenters and cedars and masons, and they built him a house. Recognizing that godliness of David, recognizing that leadership of David, recognizing who David was, that they began to send him presents. But I love how it says right here in verse 12, and David perceived that the Lord had established him king over Israel, and that he exalted his kingdom for his people Israel's sake. Because even at that age of 30, David knew what was important as a leader. And I'm just about absolutely positive with every one of you that you're done called to be a leader. And I know you guys here, you have been called to be a leader. You're leading. That's what you're doing, Jamie. You're leading. You are leading. It might not be much, but you're leading somebody. You're leading that right there, I know for sure. And you're doing a fine, I can tell from the way you're doing a fine job of it. And that's a heavy burden. This idea of leadership. Because a good leader never leads from the front. I was thinking about this morning. That was a thought in my head. I kind of got wrapped up on verse 12 a lot this morning. Did you guys, I don't know, I mean, I'm specifically asking you guys, did you guys ever see the old Moses with Charlton Heston? Good movie. Or to watch it. Comes on like the Saturday before Easter. It comes on the little channel, so you ought to watch. It's a good movie. It's a real good movie. There's a lot that's not in the Bible in it, but it's a good movie. But in my mind, and you could say that Moses was one of the greatest leaders that ever led men. I mean, that man that was called of God to lead his nation out, the man that was called of God to receive the law of God so that he could lead his nation. And I think about Moses in the wilderness, and there's a small scene in that where there's a big line of people, and there's Moses in the front of it with a stick, the stick that turned into a snake, the staff of Moses, important thing. And how Moses is walking through the wilderness, through that desert, leading those people. He's telling them where to go. But then I got to reading about it in the Bible, and I got to thinking about the number of times that Moses stayed behind. It says that he stretched out his hands across the Red Sea, and it parted. And the people crossed. Moses didn't lead them through the Red Sea. He stood there with his staff up. That was his job, to hold the line. And it talks about the times that they were in battle, and that when God told Moses to hold your hands up, and as long as your hands stay up, they'll win the battle. We don't have time to go back and look at it. I wish we did today. We might next week. I don't know. But the importance of that kind of leadership. The importance of understanding that true purpose that God's called you to when He calls you to any form of leadership, whether it's just leading your family, which is the most important, honestly. That's the number one thing. When you guys are finally old enough and you start making little versions of you, that's the number one, man. No matter what else is going on, that's the number one. I think about preacher when I think about that, and I think I know Josh Kidd's got young children, and I've never asked anybody, but I've always wondered, when did he let church forego because of his family? And I'm not saying there would be anything wrong with that, because that's your number one ministry in life. That's your family, your children, your household. The importance of governing that well. Because if you don't have that governed well, how can you do anything else? You guys don't know the number of times that I've argued with Joy on the way to church. And I can promise you, Sunday school was terrible when we did it. I wasn't thinking about Sunday school. I wasn't thinking about Awanas. I wasn't thinking about none of that stuff. I was thinking about that argument that we had. Or the number of times that my children have affected my service to the Lord. I'll never forget this. And you guys know I'm open and honest with you, and I probably say I probably say too much. But a couple years ago, would you guys remember them? We had a handful of people that was riding the bus to church on Wednesday nights, and I could have snapped every one of them's neck. I mean, you're driving across that bridge, listening to them yell and scream and have poor behavior, and you're seriously thinking, I can just turn this bus right now, and I hope you're saved, because we're all going to heaven in about 5 seconds. I'm serious heart attack. There was one night, it was so bad that I parked that bus up over there after I had taken them home, and I was almost I was so mad that I was either going to hit something or cry about it. And over the graveyard, I saw that light coming over the trees. And with the way we used to park the bus, that was the eastern sky that you looked towards. And in my heart, I knew that was a helicopter. But in my head, I was hoping it was Jesus. I was so tired of driving them kids home that I was hoping for the rapture so that I wouldn't have to do it the next week. That's how bad it was. As I live and breathe, that's how bad it was, that I seriously wanted to go to heaven, not for the sake of seeing the Lord face to face, but I will not have to take these kids to church no more. And the next week, I'm sitting there at work, and I'm thinking, on Wednesday nights, if I pick them up and I take them home, I will not see my kids before they go to bed. I don't. And I'm not looking for anybody's. I don't do this for them. I don't do it for yins. I do it for the Lord, because the Lord said, pick them up, take them home. That's what I do. So if I have to miss an evening with my kids, that's fine. But the only interaction on Wednesday nights that I actually have with my children is I hug them on the game floor. Hey, how was school? That's it. Then they're in bed by the time I get home. And there was a part of me that thought, I'm giving all of this up. So I thought I would do it right. Thursday night, I sat everybody down in the living room. I poured my heart out to them. Here's what I'm feeling. I'm feeling that I should just not drive the van anymore, not drive the bus. I'm done. I'm tired of fooling with it. I'm tired of dealing with them. It's too much aggravation. I want to see you guys. And we talked and we talked and we talked. And finally I come to the understanding that this is more important. Because those 4 children in particular, and I can name names, but I won't, they needed the Lord. That was the cure. If you just get saved, I bet that would fix 90% of the problem that we're having today. Because then at least you would have the love of Jesus inside you, like I have inside me, that makes me pick your hoodlum butts up. And at that moment, I remember we come to a real hard understanding that there was going to be some sacrifices that were going to have to be made in our household for the service of the Lord at the church. And I said all that to say this. This idea that David's leadership was solely to exalt his people. David was not a king because he wanted to be king. If you find yourself in a position of leadership, whether it's at the football game, on the baseball team, on the ball team, at a youth group, at work, if your only sole purpose of being in leadership is to exalt yourself and show everybody how great you are, I promise you, the first time you mess up, you'll realize how weak and feeble that is. Because if you're doing it for yourself, if you're doing it for your own glory, as we get further into this book, you're going to see more and more, and we've already discussed it a little bit, but you're going to see more and more the weakness that David had about his life. David was a weak man. He was a great man, but he was weak. He had some places in him that he was so weak he killed a man one time. And you guys know we've talked about Bathsheba, but we'll get more into it when we actually get to that portion of 2 Samuel. But that's how weak of a human being that David was, that through his weakness and his inability to control himself, that he wound up killing a man so he could have his wife. That's pretty weak. We see where David loses his kingdom to his son because he is scared to do what he has to do, which is to kill his son. And I know you're thinking, oh, it's to kill your son. Once again, David, you're in a place of leadership. Sometimes this ain't about you. It's about everybody else around you. And when we get to that part of Absalom, and I know that I am greatly exaggerating my case about my family. But David exalted his people at the sake of his family. And there's nothing wrong with putting your family first, and that's what you should do. But sometimes God calls you to leave everything. I hope and pray that one of you guys, and I think I know the one that I'm thinking of, and I've talked to you about it a little bit before, I think you're possibly going to be called out of this country one of these days to serve the Lord. I think you got the heart for it. I think you got the guts for it. I like the way you're talking about it. And you're supposed to honor your mother and father, but I promise you, if the Lord's told you that you need to go to Timbuktu and set up some small-time missionary camp, doesn't matter what mom and dad has to say. Because God's called you to exalt his people, and his people in Timbuktu need you to lead them. So I'll leave you with this, and then we'll be done. We can read ahead. Gentlemen, read ahead. We're going to blow through it real quickly, how God told David how to fight, and we see the Philistines rise up again, and how David subdues them, one time through open battle and one time through deception. And that's a mark of how David let God work through his life and God lead his army. And that's the true mark of leadership, is that even though you're the leader, you're not the leader. The true mark of leadership is who your leader is, which is the Lord ultimately. But this idea of exalting the people of God, one of the great marks of that, guys, is the call to meekness, strength under control. And I'm telling you, young men, I'm telling you, that is such a faux pas, I guess. And I know you guys don't really know what that word means, but you've heard me use it a lot. In today's society, you're called to be one of two things. Either you're called to be a sissy and cow under everybody, or you're called to just be this big, brash, bullheaded, no-thinking human being male. And that's not what the Lord calls us to be. And I know, once again, I seriously, I apologize for this Sunday school class that we're in, because I deal with the young men. But my challenge, my mark to you guys, is to help yins, to show yins, to lead yins along that there is nothing wrong with being a godly man in this society. Being a man who does the right thing because it's right to do. And when we look at this idea of David exalting his people, it is such a thing nowadays for everybody to want to be that guy in the light. You guys, help me out, Eli, because my mind's slipping. Who was the guy that dressed up like a big sissy at the press conference there for the NFL the other day? Come on now. You know, he had the scarf on. Man, there's so many memes on him about Facebook. Can't think of his name to save my life. But anyhow, could you imagine dressing like that? He looked like a girl. My grandma dresses tougher than that. She's right here. But that was cool. And in David's life, he probably had the opportunity to be great, really great, super great. But one of the things that we're going to learn about David is a lot of times David allowed himself to be less than other people. And we've already seen that with Abner and with Ishbosheth, how he made a peace accord with them. How David allowed himself to be the weaker person because he was the stronger person. And that's meekness. That's what we see in that setting, that we are called to be meek. And that's probably one of the toughest things that I know I deal with it. That fine walk between pride and lowliness. That hard. I think about your son in particular, and I've been keeping up with him on football. Looking good, man. He's got a lot of good-looking pictures out there. And I hope and I pray that don't blow his head up. Young men, remember where your place is. And I think that's what we see in David. That David remembered at this point in time in his life where his place was. That although he was the leader of one of the greatest nations that ever walked the planet Earth, the nation that God said is my people, and I will protect them, and I will use them, and I will exalt them above all nations, that even though David was the leader of that, he was still underneath the Lord the entire time. So we'll continue on this theme. We'll continue on this thought next week. Please, young men, read ahead. If you guys want to, we'll go through the rest of chapter 5. And we won't get into Obed-Edom yet. I like Obed-Edom. We'll have a lot to talk about with him. But we will get into the ark next week. Thank you.